A black single father showed up to his first day managing a failing orchard with nothing but a bucket of white paint and a brush. The neighbors watched from the road. Some slowed their trucks, some just shook their heads. By the end of the week, the whole town was laughing. By October, nobody was laughing anymore. If you've ever done the right thing while everyone around you called it foolish, this one is for you. Stay with us. Marcus Webb had not been looking for this job when he found it. He had been looking for something smaller, something that would keep him close to home and close to his daughter, and far from the kind of work that required him to be somewhere else when she needed him to be somewhere near. He had spent the better part of a decade doing agricultural consulting across 4 states, the kind of work that paid well enough but moved constantly, and after his wife passed 3 years ago, he had made a decision that was not complicated to make, even if it was hard to execute. He was going to stop moving. He was going to find something rooted. He was going to be in the same place every morning when his daughter Lily woke up. Lily was 9 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and an opinion about everything, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had been thinking about it for much longer than you might expect. She kept a notebook in which she recorded things she considered worth remembering, facts about animals, things her father said that she thought were correct, things her teacher said that she thought were wrong. She had been filling notebooks since she was 6 and had accumulated 11 of them, stored in a box under her bed in the order she had filled them, labeled by year and month in her careful handwriting. Marcus had moved them 4 times in 3 years. He intended not to move them again. The Hargrove orchard sat 7 miles outside the town of Millhaven on a piece of land that had been producing peaches for 3 generations before the Hargrove family ran out of people willing to manage it properly. The last manager had left without notice 8 months prior, and in the time since, the orchard had been running on the labor of 2 part-time workers who knew how to pick fruit but not how to keep trees healthy, and the distant oversight of a land management company in the city that sent someone out twice a year and filed reports that described the operation as stable when what they meant was that it had not yet collapsed. Marcus had been contacted by the Hargrove family through a referral from a man he had worked with years earlier in Georgia. The referral had described him as someone who knew what he was doing and did it without requiring supervision, which was accurate, and as someone who was difficult to read, which was also accurate, but which Marcus considered a reasonable quality in a person who had learned that being easy to read in the wrong room tended to cost you something. He had driven out to the orchard on a Wednesday morning in late March, walked every row, examined the bark on 214 trees, checked the soil composition in 6 different locations, looked at the irrigation lines, inspected the storage facility, and spent 40 minutes in the small office reviewing what records the previous manager had kept, which were not extensive. He had called the Hargrove family that evening and told them he would take the job under 3 conditions. First, he would need a small house on the property or close to it because he had a daughter in school and could not commute from the city. Second, he would need full authority over all management decisions without requiring approval for standard operational choices. Third, he would need a budget allocation for materials in the first month that was larger than what they were currently spending, because there were things that needed to be done immediately that had not been done and that would become significantly more expensive if they were delayed further. The Hargrove family had agreed to all 3 conditions without significant negotiation, which told Marcus that they were either very reasonable people or very worried ones. He suspected both. He and Lily moved into the small house on the edge of the property on the first Saturday of April. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled like old wood, and a porch that looked out over the nearest row of trees. Lily walked through each room with her notebook open and recorded her observations. "The kitchen window faces east," she wrote. "Good for morning. The porch is the best part." She claimed the bedroom with the larger window and arranged her notebooks under the bed in their box and declared the house acceptable. Marcus started work the following Monday. The first thing he did was buy white paint. Not house paint, a specific formulation, kaolin clay mixed into a diluted whitewash, the kind that had been used in orchards in warmer climates for generations and that had largely fallen out of practice in this part of the country, not because it didn't work, but because it looked unusual, and things that looked unusual made people uncomfortable, and people who were uncomfortable tended to stop doing the unusual thing even when the unusual thing was correct. Marcus had learned about it from an old man named Ezra who had worked a peach operation in central Georgia for 41 years and whose trees had consistently produced fruit that buyers drove significant distances to purchase. Ezra had explained the principle simply: the way he explained most things. The white paint reflects solar radiation. It moderates the temperature of the cambium layer, the living tissue just beneath the bark. In late winter and early spring, when warm spells come and cold follows, unprotected bark wakes up too fast and then gets killed by the frost. The tree doesn't show the damage immediately. It shows it 6 months later, when the fruit comes in small and poorly formed, and the farmer stands there wondering what went wrong. Marcus had watched Ezra's trees and watched the trees of men who didn't use the technique and had understood the difference in a way that did not require further argument. He bought enough whitewash for 214 trees and started applying it the first week. Carl Briggs drove past on the third morning. Carl was 61 years old and had farmed the land adjacent to the Hargrove property for 34 years, which in his understanding conferred a degree of expertise about everything that happened within eyeshot of his fence line. He slowed his truck when he saw Marcus kneeling at the base of a tree with a brush in his hand and a white bucket beside him, and he rolled down his window and looked for a long moment before he spoke. "What in the world are you doing to those trees?" Marcus did not look up. "Painting them." Carl looked at the row behind Marcus, each trunk coated white from the soil line to the first branch, and at the rows ahead where the unpainted brown bark waited, and he shook his head with the slow certainty of a man who has already reached a conclusion and is simply confirming it. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've seen in 30 years of farming," he said. He said it without particular malice, in the tone of someone reporting an observable fact. Then he drove away. By noon he had mentioned it at the feed store. By the following Tuesday, it had reached the diner on Main Street, where a group of men who gathered for coffee on Tuesday mornings discussed it with the comfortable authority of people who have opinions about things they have not personally examined. The consensus was that the new man at the Hargrove place didn't know what he was doing, or possibly did know what he was doing and was doing it wrong, or was running some kind of scheme that would become clear in time. The white paint in particular was considered evidence of something, though the group was not entirely united on what. Marcus was aware that people were talking. He was not particularly troubled by it. He had worked in enough places to understand that unfamiliar methods generated commentary before they generated results, and that the commentary was not the part worth paying attention to. He finished painting all 214 trees by the end of the second week. Then he turned to the other things that needed doing. The irrigation lines had 3 blockages that had gone unaddressed long enough to create pressure imbalances affecting roughly 40 trees on the eastern side of the orchard. He cleared them over 2 days. The fence line along the north boundary had a section that was compromised enough to allow deer access during the night hours, which he repaired on the 3rd day. He adjusted the pruning on 60 trees that had been left too long and were directing energy into wood rather than fruit. He tested the soil in the areas where production had been lowest and found a phosphorus deficiency that he corrected with a targeted amendment. He did all of this without announcement and without asking for recognition, because it was simply the work and the work needed doing. Lily came to find him in the orchard after school most days. She would walk the rows with her notebook and ask questions. She asked why some trees had more fruit buds than others, and he explained about pruning and energy allocation. She asked why the soil was a different color in some places, and he explained about drainage and mineral composition. She asked why the trunks were painted white, and he explained about the cambium and the temperature fluctuation and the frost, and she wrote it all down in her careful handwriting, and then looked up at him with an expression he recognized as the one she wore when she had understood something completely. "So the white paint is like sunscreen," she said. Marcus considered this. "Yes," he said, "exactly like sunscreen." She wrote that down too. Carl Briggs came back in early May, this time with his son-in-law Dennis, who had recently taken over management of the Briggs farm and who Carl was apparently educating about the neighboring operation as an example of what not to do. They stood at the fence line and looked at the painted trunks for a while, and Dennis said something that made Carl laugh, and Carl said something back, and they drove away. Marcus was on the far side of the orchard and could not hear what was said, but he could read the posture well enough. He continued working. Through May and into June, the trees progressed. The irrigation corrections were showing results in the eastern section, where the foliage had been thinner than the rest of the orchard, the leaves now coming in fuller and darker. The pruning adjustments were redirecting energy in ways that would be visible at harvest, but were already showing in the quality of the developing fruit. Marcus walked his rows each morning before Lily was awake. In the hour before sunrise, when the light was still gray and the air was still cool, checking each tree with the attention of someone who understood that the work was not dramatic and not visible and would not announce itself until October, and that the only way to get to October was to do the unglamorous daily version of it correctly, every day, without an audience. A woman named Ruth, who lived on the other side of the orchard, stopped him at the property line one morning in late June. She was in her 70s, had lived on her land longer than anyone in the immediate area, and had a directness that Marcus recognized as the kind that came from having lived long enough to stop considering whether something needed softening. "People in town think you don't know what you're doing," she said. "I know," Marcus said. She looked at the trees for a moment. "Do you know what you're doing?" "Yes," Marcus said. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once, the nod of a person making a private assessment and filing it away. "My husband painted trees," she said. 30 years ago. People laughed at him too. She looked at the white trunks. His trees were always the best in the county. She went back inside without further comment. Marcus thought about this for a while after she left. Then he went back to work. July came in hot and dry, the kind of July that tested orchards and the people who managed them. The irrigation corrections proved their value over those weeks, the trees with restored water access handling the heat measurably better than they had in previous years, according to the records Marcus had reviewed. He monitored the moisture levels daily and made adjustments, and the trees progressed through the heat without the stress damage that would have shown itself later in the season. It was in late July that Carl Briggs's orchard took its first significant hit. A fungal issue that had been developing quietly for weeks made itself visible all at once across a section of his trees, the kind of outbreak that happened when air circulation was poor and moisture management had been inconsistent. Carl lost a portion of his crop on the western side of his property, not all of it, but enough to be noticeable and enough to be frustrating. He did not come to the fence line that week. August was quieter. The fruit on the Hargrove trees was developing well, sizing up in the way that healthy fruit sized up when the tree had the resources to support it properly. Marcus walked his rows and looked at each tree with the attention of someone who had been having a very long conversation with 214 individuals and was now beginning to understand what each of them had to say. Lily had started a new section in her notebook specifically about the orchard. She recorded her observations with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had decided this was a subject worth tracking. She noted the changes in the foliage color week by week. She noted the size of the developing fruit at intervals. She noted the things her father told her and the things she observed herself. And occasionally, she noted the things the neighbors said, because she had heard some of it and had opinions about it that she recorded with characteristic directness. "They don't know what the white paint is for," she wrote. "They think it's just paint. It isn't just paint." September came, and with it the beginning of the harvest season in the surrounding county. Marcus walked his rows and looked at the fruit and looked at the trees and understood that what he was seeing was the result of what had been done correctly in March and April and May and June and July and August, all of it accumulated and visible now in the weight and color and quality of the peaches coming in. He scheduled the harvest for the first week of October and contacted the buyers he had reached out to earlier in the season. Carl Briggs stood at his fence line on the morning. Marcus began the harvest and watched for a while without speaking. The harvest crew moved through the rows with steady efficiency, the bins filling with fruit that was large and well-formed and deeply colored. Marcus was at the far end of the first row when he noticed Carl standing there, and he continued working and did not go over, because the work was the work and there was nothing to say that the fruit wasn't already saying more clearly. By the end of the second day of harvest, it was clear to anyone paying attention that the Hargrove orchard was having the best season it had seen in more than a decade. The buyers who came to assess and purchase were not restrained in their comments. Word moved through the county the way word moved through small communities, quickly and with the specific energy that accompanied information that required people to revise something they had previously decided. The men at the diner on Tuesday morning had a quieter conversation than usual. Carl Briggs came to the fence line on the third day of harvest. He stood there for a while and then walked over to where Marcus was working, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided to do something that is costing him something and has committed to it anyway. "I owe you an apology," Carl said. He said it plainly, without decoration, in the tone of a man who has thought about how to say something and decided that the simplest version was the correct one. "I laughed at what you were doing. I told people about it. I brought Dennis out here to look at it." He paused. "I was wrong. Marcus looked at him steadily. "I know," he said. It was not said unkindly. Carl looked at the bins of fruit. He was quiet for a moment. "The white paint," he said. "Where did you learn that?" Marcus told him about Ezra, about the Georgia orchard and the 41 years and the buyers who came from 3 counties away. He told it the way Ezra had told him, simply and completely, without asking whether the person in front of him was ready to hear it. Carl listened with the attention of a man who has already paid for the lesson and intends to get the full value of it. "My trees on the western side," Carl said. "The ones that had trouble this year. Would it help them?" "Yes," Marcus said. "Come find me after harvest. We'll walk your rows." Carl nodded. He stood there for another moment looking at the orchard, at the white trunks visible between the rows, at the crew working steadily through the fruit. Then he looked at Marcus with an expression that was different from any expression he had worn before, the expression of a man who has set down something he had been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. "I should have asked before I laughed," Carl said. Marcus looked at him. "Most people don't," he said. "That's not a reason to stop asking." Carl went back to his property. Marcus went back to his trees. Lily was at the end of the row after school that afternoon, sitting on an overturned bin with her notebook open, recording the day's harvest numbers in her careful columns. She looked up when Marcus came to the end of the row, and she looked at the place where Carl had been standing, and then she looked at her father. "Was that the man who laughed?" she asked. "Yes," Marcus said. She considered this. "What did he say?" "He said he was wrong." Lily thought about this for a moment. Then she wrote something in her notebook. Marcus looked over her shoulder. She had written, "The man who laughed came back and said sorry. Dad said most people don't ask before they laugh." That's true. He looked at his daughter for a moment and felt the particular warmth of being understood accurately by the person who mattered most to understand him. "Come on," he said. "Let's finish the row." She closed her notebook, tucked it under her arm, and fell into step beside him, and they moved together through the last of the afternoon light, with the fruit heavy on either side of them, and the white trunks standing in their rows, and the bins filling steadily toward the end of a season that had been decided not in October, but in March, on a morning when a man with a bucket of white paint had knelt at the base of a tree while his neighbor drove past laughing and had kept working anyway. The harvest that year was the largest the Hargrove orchard had produced in 11 years. The buyers came back. The word spread in the way that results spread, quietly at first, and then all at once, and what spread with it was not the story of the white paint, but the story behind the white paint, the story of a man who knew what he was doing and did it without requiring anyone's belief in advance. Ruth came to the fence line on the last day of harvest. She looked at the empty rows and the full bins and the exhausted but satisfied crew, and then she looked at Marcus. "My husband would have liked you," she said. Marcus nodded. "I would have liked him." She went back inside. The last bin was loaded. The crew went home. Marcus stood alone at the end of the final row as the sun went down over the orchard and the light went gold and long across the white trunks and the empty branches and the turned earth between the rows. He thought about Ezra. He thought about his wife. He thought about the men at the diner and Carl Briggs standing at the fence and the particular quality of laughter that comes from people who are certain about something they have not examined. He thought about Lily's notebook and the entry she had made that afternoon and the one she would make tonight, and he thought about the trees, 214 of them, standing in their rows with their white trunks and their now empty branches, having done exactly what they were always capable of doing once someone gave them what they needed. He did not think about October with any satisfaction. October was simply when the work became visible. The work had been done in March and April, and every day between. That was where the real story lived, in the unglamorous daily version of it, in the kneeling at the base of trees with a brush while someone drove past and shook their head, in the walking of rows before sunrise when there was nothing yet to see, in the choosing, every single day, to trust what you knew over what the room around you was willing to believe. Lily was on the porch when he came back to the house, her notebook open on her knees, the lamp on beside her in the falling dark. She looked up when he came up the steps. "Is it done?" she asked. "It's done," he said. She nodded and wrote something in her notebook, and then closed it and looked out at the dark orchard. "Will you do it again next year?" she asked. "The white paint?" "Yes," Marcus said, "even if people laugh again." He sat down beside her on the porch step and looked out at the rows of trees visible in the last of the light, their white trunks faintly luminous in the dusk. "Especially then," he said. Lily considered this. Then she opened her notebook again and wrote something and closed it again and leaned against her father's arm the way she had been leaning against him since she was small enough to fit entirely under one shoulder, and they sat there together on the porch of the house that was not moving anymore, looking out at the orchard that had given them October, while the dark came in around the trees and the white trunks disappeared one by one into the night. The whole town laughed at his white trees. They laughed in March and they laughed in April, and they kept laughing through the long summer while he worked without an audience and without their approval, and without once adjusting what he was doing to make them more comfortable with it. And then October came, and the trees that had been painted white were heavy with the best fruit the county had seen in a decade, and the laughter stopped, not because he had argued with anyone, not because he had proven a point, but because the trees proved it for him, the way the truth always proves itself eventually, quietly and completely and without asking anyone's permission. Do the work. Trust what you know. Let October come.